Okay, I wanted to make another video commenting on the last video I had you look at from YouTube. It was by Professor Melissa Brown from Stanford, and she is a professor of anthropology, and she was talking about some of the application of Darwinian theory and some of the ramifications of those applications. At about 25 minutes into her presentation, she talked about evolution as potential, which is kind of the broader view of how evolution was viewed during Darwin's day. I think it's interesting, Melissa Brown coming from a social science perspective as opposed to a geological or biological aspect, mentioned that many anthropologists have problems with Darwin's theory of evolution. She says, if you're a biologist, you're probably reading Origin of Species, or a zoologist, but if you're an anthropologist, you're probably most familiar with Darwin's Descent of Man. And if you've ever looked at the Descent of Man, it's full of the biases and prejudices of 19th century England, and Europe and America for that matter. Anyways, back to evolution as potential. When Darwin wrote Origin of Species, he did not even use the phrase survival of the fittest. That came out in the second edition, and it was actually coined by Spencer, who saw more of a view of this idea of it's the most fit of a species that will pass on their genes and carry on, and the less fit, of course, are the ones who will not reproduce. How we talk about fitness, though, at least in Spencer's terms, fit would have to do with racial categories or social class. And so when you start talking about which races or which social classes should be allowed to reproduce, obviously in 19th century England the idea is the upper classes, the wealthy, the nobility, etc. And so we'll kind of see how this plays out in applied Darwinian theory. Also in anthropology at the time, following the lines of people like Henry Morgan, civilizations were seen as going through stages from savagery to barbarism to the civilized. And many people believe that you could look at a civilization's tools, whether they were using stone tools or iron tools or steel tools, and based on those tools you could evaluate how evolved those civilizations were. Obviously this was coming from a Eurocentric perspective, and so people were comparing other civilizations or races with what Europe had accomplished in the 19th century. At about 27 minutes into the video, Melissa Brown begins to talk about eugenics, and even though I don't believe this was proposed by Darwin himself, one of the founders of eugenics was Darwin's cousin Francis Galton, who wrote the book Hereditary Genius. Many people of power and influence greatly admired this book, including Winston Churchill, who wanted to implement eugenics into England. But he was stopped by none other than the famous preacher G.K. Chesterton, who was able to raise enough parliamentary support to block it. However, in the United States, the eugenics movement was implemented, and this was formulated largely by Charles Davenport, who was the keeper of the eugenics record office, and this was funded by the Carnegie Institute. It's also interesting that Melissa Brown talked about how Stanford had big ties in with eugenics with Louis Terman, who was influential in helping create the Stanford-Binet IQ test. And these IQ tests were used to determine who were the most fit in society, who should be allowed to breed and who would not. Another major player in this would be Margaret Sanger, who we know as the founder of Planned Parenthood, and you can see the connections here of using Planned Parenthood as a tool to keeping the less fit members of society, mostly the poor, people of different ethnic groups that weren't seen as fit, and trying to keep their populations to a minimum while trying to encourage the population growth of those who were seen as more fit. The unfit were sterilized, and births of the fit were promoted. We talked about Spencer defining the fit along racial and class lines, and this started with they wanted to limit the reproduction of the Jews, Irish, and Italians who weren't considered white at the time. Then these restrictions went to the people of Spanish descent, Africans, Americans, and Indians. By the 1920s, eugenics was being promoted at county fairs across the United States. There were contests for better families, better babies, etc. And I believe in the 20s, the U.S. passed compulsory sterilization laws. Nazi sterilization laws were based on U.S. laws, and you can see this at 32 minutes into the video. And by World War II, 30 of the 48 states had sterilization laws, where people that were considered imbeciles or the mentally retarded were systematically sterilized so they could not produce like offspring. By 1968, over 65,000 people had been sterilized in the United States, and by 1992, 22 states still had sterilization laws on the books. And I don't know, when you begin to think about these ideas of social Darwinism and how it affects, you basically could make a chart, and on top of this chart it would be just like the Great Chain of Being, except if you put it in human context. For example, on the very top you would have your Aryan Nordic races, followed by Celts, Slavs, Eastern Europeans, then this would be the Semitic peoples, or the Mediterranean, then Semitic peoples like Jews, Arabs, etc. These would all be seen in the Caucasoid part of the human family. The next would be the Mongoloid races, and depending on who you ask, if you ask a Chinese person, they would be on top, followed by Koreans, Japanese, Malaysians, Polynesians, etc. And then we would come down to the Negroid races, and these would be seen as the people of Africa, etc. And then below them would be Aborigine type races, and these would be like the people of Australia or the indigenous people of the Americas. And depending on social Darwinism, the view was basically the more advanced you were, in this case the whiter you were, the more Caucasian you were, the more evolved you were, and the darker you were, the less evolved you were. And if you look at many pre-civil rights evolutionary texts in the United States, you will see incredible racial bias and I guess prototyping, you could say, looking at these different races and assuming that they were less evolved than these white Anglo-Aryan sort of races in the United States. Now, a nicer version of this model would be called the white man's burden, and this was where the more European races were seen as the adult races, and the Mongoloid or Asiatic races were seen as adolescent races, and the Negroid or black races were seen as child races, and it was the white man's responsibility, kind of like a great white father, that we need to look after these races, bring them up until they came into maturity. I mean, that's the nice version of it. The negative version is survival of the fittest applied. If you can't defend yourself or your resources, then you will be dominated and used by races that are superior to yourself. And it's easy to point out this in Darwinian theory and see, and I'm not saying Darwin advocated it, I believed he was susceptible to the prejudices of his day, but this came after Darwin and was people justifying imperialism and enslavement of others using Darwinian theory. And before creationists get too high and mighty and say, yeah, look at that, look at what evolutionist causes, and it degrades human beings, Christians were doing the same thing. They simply called it manifest destiny, and this was the belief that God had destined the white races to conquer America from sea to shining sea. The Native Americans were seen as savage, as people that if they were human, they were very subhuman, but many people didn't even believe they were human at all, but they were like animals. There was no more crime in shooting an Indian than there was of killing a grizzly bear. They were just seen as dangerous pests or vermin. And the same with the enslavement of the black people. That's simply the natural order of how God made things, and to rebel against that natural order was to rebel against God. So prejudice and racism can be justified through evolutionary theory or through the Bible, and people are people. But I think it was really interesting, and I really appreciated Melissa Brown pointing out those dark spots in Darwin's record. All right, thanks.